heures. Ok. Donc, le chapitre 2 s'appelle Content and Causation. J'ai déjà lu un peu, donc je vais prendre un paragraphe, pas dès le premier paragraphe, mais voilà, un peu après. La dernière phrase, c'était, il parlait des propriétés des œuvres d'art, et il dit « They have only in common those properties that the eye as such might identify. So much the worse for the properties that meet the eye, then, in individuating works of art. And Borges' example has the philosophical effect of forcing us to avert our eye from the surfaces of things, and to ask in what, if not surfaces, the differences between distinct works must consist. Borges tells us that the Quixote of Minar is infinitely more subtle than that of Cervantes, while that of Cervantes is immeasurably more coarse than its counterpart, even though every word contained in the Menard version can be found in Cervantes and in the corresponding position. Cervantes opposes to the fiction of chivalry the tawdry provincial reality of his country. Maynard, on the other hand, selects for its reality the land of Carmen during the century of Lepanto and Lope de Vega. These are, of course, descriptions of the same place and time, but the mode of referring to them belongs to different times. It would not have been feasible for Cervantes to refer to Spain as the land of Carmen, Carmen being a 19th century literary personality familiar, of course, to Maynard. And the tawdry provincial reality of his country is a false characterization when applied to Maynard's book, since the country designated in Spain and Maynard was a French man. It would have been ridiculous for Maynard to have opposed the fiction of chivalry, since that literature had already long since been demolished by Cervantes. And though Maynard was perhaps making an oblique characterization of Salammbô as a piece of historical fiction, no such intention would have been possible for Cervantes, who was after all a contemporary of Shakespeare. The contrast in style is also vivid. Borges writes, the archaic style of Maynard, quite foreign after all, suffers from a certain affection. Not so that of his forerunner, who handles with ease the current Spanish of his time. Had Maynard lived to complete his Don Quixote, he would have had to invent one character more than was required for Cervantes' fancy, namely the author of the so-called, uniquely in Maynard's case, autobiographical fragment. And so on. It is not just that the books are written at different times by different authors of different nationalities and literary intentions. These facts are not external ones. They serve to characterize the works and, of course, to individuate them for all their graphic indiscernibility. That is to say, the works are in part constituted by their location in the history of literature, as well as by their relationships to their authors, and as these are often dismissed by critics who urge us to pay attention to the work itself, Borges' contribution to the ontology of art is stupendous. You cannot isolate these factors from the work, since they penetrate, so to speak, the essence of the work. And so, graphic congruities notwithstanding, these are deeply different works. It is a matter worth speculating upon how indictments of the so-called intentional fallacy survive the literary achievement of Maynard. We may reflect for a moment on the relationship in which the two works stand to one another apart from the fact of their retinal indiscernibility. To begin with, in contrast with our array of red squares, each of which may be an independent creation in the sense that the artist who painted Kierkegaard's mood had no knowledge of, say, the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, so that the outward resemblances between the two works are matters of pure coincidence, Maynard's work is not a miracle of coincidence. The pre-existence of Cervantes' work enters into the explanation of Maynard's work. Moreover, Maynard is conscious of his predecessor as a predecessor. He is not the sort of case illustrated by Rodin, who discovered that one of his ombres from the Porte d'Enfer was an exact replica, rotated through 90 degrees, of the figure of Adam on the Sistine ceiling, sketched and admired by Rodin 40 years earlier on a pilgrimage to Italy. Manet did not discover that what he had written was word for word what Cervantes had set down. His aim was to recreate a work already well known to him. So what he produced was a work and his. It was not a copy, therefore, since any fool could copy Cervantes' work and the results would be just that, a copy that would have only the literary value of the original. It would require only those skills required by facsimilation. The copyist would be merely a mechanism of duplication, like a Xerox machine, and without having to have the slightest literary gifts. Whereas Manet's act would be a literary achievement of some even amazing sort. A forgery of so famous a work bespeaks that sort of gullibility involved in undertaking to convince the Duke of Wellington that you are the Duke of Wellington. It would be a fiasco. Manet's audience would have to be a subtle audience and realized in reading his work that it was addressed to a reality already including the work of Cervantes as a historical feature of itself, so that reference to the earlier work would be part of what the later work was about. Nor is Manet's a quotation of the original. There is a difference to be marked between a copy and a quotation, in the respect that a copy, as suggested, merely replaces an original and inherits its structure and relationship to the world. A number of persons who receive copies of the same letter receive in effect the same letter and stand in exactly the same relationship to the information the letter conveys. But if one of them, in a letter of his own, should quote the letter, what he writes is not a copy, since it denotes the letter rather than what the letter itself denotes and has, in consequence, a different subject and so a different meaning. It is a general truth that quotations do not really possess the properties possessed by what is quoted. They show something that has those properties, but do not have themselves. A quotation cannot be scintillating, profound, witty, or shrewd. Or if it is, these qualities are attached to the circumstances of quotation and not to the passages quoted. There are, indeed, theories of quotation, according to which quotations lack any semantical structure, simply displaying what lies within the space marked by quotation marks, naming, as it were, the passage thus embraced. And a name either is without structure, or at least will have a different structure than what is named by it. But in any case, if Manet were quoting that work, what his would be about would just be the book of Cervantes rather than the land of Carmen in the century of Lepanto and Lope de Vega. Again, his cannot be easily assimilated to the concept of imitation, at least not if we retain the implication that an imitation X is not an X. Cervantes had his imitators and epigones, to whom he responds savagely and sadly in the second part of his masterpiece. But certainly Manet would have been none of these. Nor is it an imitation Don Quixote, it is a real Don Quixote, but Manet's rather than Cervantes. And in some deep way, it is an extremely original work, so original indeed that we would be hard pressed to find a predecessor for it in the entire history of literature. Who before Manet would have had the daring to attempt to rederive out of his own creative impulses a work which sprang from so different a set of impulses at so different a time and in the breast of so different, and in a way so much less sophisticated, an artist? It is worth thinking of another of Borges' mad literati, about whom he writes in the Chronicles of Bustos de Mec, who applied and generalized upon the principle of what Borges speaks as the amplification of the unit. The principle is more or less this. Eliot took whole lines from other poets and incorporated them into his own work. Pound took over large sections of Homer in the cantos. Borges' figure went one step further and took over whole works, such as Captain's Courageous or Huckleberry Finn. To be sure, there is a question of what work of his incorporated these, and I suppose all that would have remained, were we to subtract Huckleberry Finn from his Huckleberry Finn, would be simply the principle of amplification itself. Still, this writer's gift was exhausted by his powers of selection. He took over whole works, whereas Manet wrote a new work, and the difference in scale is evidenced by the fact that the most that Manet attained to, in fact, was a fragment. Finally, I think, Manet's work cannot be considered a repetition of Cervantes. Simply because two works resemble one another does not mean that the artist of the one is repeating the artist of the other. The painter David Burliuk once told me that he painted the things he loved: his wife, his friends, his part of Long Island. He also loved paintings, among others the Shrimp Girl of Hogarth, which he painted several times. These paintings represent the Shrimp Girl, much as others represent aspects of Hampton Bays. Well, suppose Brelliac were to love one of his own paintings as much as he loved Hogarth's, and he painted in the same spirit as he did the Shrimp Girl his own portrait of Leda Berryman. He no doubt loved Leda since he painted her, and loved the painting of Leda since he painted it. But it would be difficult to say he was repeating himself, since the subject of the one painting was another. Berlioc's well of inspiration had not run dry. Nor again was he copying himself. We judge a copy by how accurate it is, and if someone were to criticize one of these paintings on the grounds that it was inaccurate, Berlioz might have laughed. The question of accuracy cannot arise when the painting in question is not to begin with an attempted copy. If inaccuracy is irrelevant, so is accuracy, leaving the possibility of that the painting of Portrait of Leda should be exactly like the Portrait of Leda in every touch and detail. We must be extremely cautious in claiming that an artist is repeating himself, or, for the matter, another artist. Schumann's last composition was based on a theme he claimed was dictated to him by angels in his sleep, but was in fact the slow movement of his own recently published violin concerto. Is it altogether an accident that Schumann was working on a book of quotations at the time of his Sesame Brush? Robert Desnos' dernier poème, Yuki, j'ai tant rêvé de toi que tu perds ta réalité, is simply, according to Mary Ann Cause, yes, um, a retranslation into French of the rough and truncated translation into Sèche of his earlier and famous poem addressed to the French actress Yvonne George. But was Desnos delirious when he addressed this poem at his death to Yuki, or think she was Yvonne George, or think it was a new poem, or was it as much a new poem as Manet's was a new novel? I mentioned Schumann and Desnos together with Berlioz in part to show that the problem transcends the differences between these arts. Repetitions are maddening, but the main question is whether indeed these are really describable as cases of it. In Holland, in the 17th century, artists who found a particular subject saleable did not hesitate to repeat it for commercial purposes, and a certain stigma seems to attach to this treatment of paintings as commercial products, as if there was something incompatible between the concept of artistic authenticity and the application of what amounts to a kind of formula. No doubt Canaletto used something like a formula, but it is also possible to regard each work as a fresh artistic response to Venice. Morandi addressed himself over and over again to the painting of bottles, a kind of obsession, but would it be right to suppose that he had a formula or that he was repeating himself? What makes the difference between his case and that of Chagall, who has often been charged with that sort of repetition? It cannot be just that Chagall's works all resemble one another in treatment and topic, since this is true of Morandi as well. The case of Maynard can only carry us a certain distance toward the resolution of our problem. Close attention to the relationship between his work and that of Cervantes brings to light a number of deeply interesting relationships between the identity of a work and the time and place and provenance of the work, so much so that identification of its subject and style cannot be effected in complete historical abstraction. And by asking the relationships in which two seemingly indiscernible objects can stand to one another, we have brought to the surface a variety of elements that, as a matter of intuition, belong to the concept of an artwork. Still, the pairs involved are in either instance artworks, or appear to be, and the question is whether considering them helps to illuminate the boundary of ultimate concern to us, namely what separates any work from a mere object which, though it may resemble it precisely, happens not to be a work at all. Perhaps enough has been brought out through this brief exploration to enable us to begin to discern some of the things that appear to be involved. So let us construct one further example in order to make them explicit. Neckties, by common consent, are absurd items of masculine haberdashery, and some concerted effort has been made in late times to rationalize costume by eliminating them in favor of turtlenecks or such explicit pieces of ornamentation as love beds. And at the same time, neckties have begun to make an appearance in works of art. I have not traced the entire history, but the first appearance I am aware of was a representation in a witty etching by Jim Dine showing a singularly banal striped cravat in the punning title The Universal Tie, which sounds cosmic and as if it were to have been an allegory of a Whiteheadian nexus, or the principle of causality, or the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Not long after, a gigantesque tie, stitched on a gigantesque shirt, was exhibited by Claes Oldenburg, and then a combine made of a number of recognizably real neckties, discards from the world of fashion, appeared in a work by John Duff entitled Timepiece. In 1975, the floodgates were opened, and an entire exhibition was given over to ties in a gallery on Madison Avenue. Artists are now obsessed by ties. Gary Lejeski is quoted by the New York Times of 10 January 1975 as having said, "Some artists love ties, some hate them, some dissect them. We have ties made of pins and ties made of hair. A stained glass necktie was broken, and we must console ourselves with the windows at Chartres, though these themselves are succumbing to a recent effort to preserve them, which is another story." In any case, let us suppose that just before his death, as the crowning work of his already amazing corpus, Picasso himself had made a tie, which I shall describe this way. Picasso, who of course had not worn one for years, found one of his old ties and painted it a bright blue all over. The paint was applied smoothly and carefully, and every trace of brush stroke was purged. It was a repudiation of painterliness, le peinture, of that apotheosis of paint and brushstroke or drip which defined New York painting of the 1950s as a movement. Picasso's smooth paint, then, may be reckoned part of the content of the work in roughly the same way in which absence of geotesque perspective must be considered a positive part of the Strozzi altarpiece, if Millard Mess is right about the deliberate archaism of that work. Picasso's tie, Le Cravate, is exhibited with other works from the master's hand, and someone falling past it is heard to mutter that his child could do that. And I want to agree, as far as this subject is concerned. So let us imagine that a child gets hold of one of his father's ties and covers it with blue paint, which he makes as smooth as possible with blue paint from the same company, Sapolin, which manufactured the paint Picasso used to make it nice, as he explains. I would hesitate to predict a glorious artistic future for this child merely on the grounds that he had produced an entity indiscernible from one turned out by the greatest master of modern times. It is not as if the child had covered the walls of the living room with something not to be told apart from the legend of the true cross. I am prepared to go further and insist that even though there is the sort of indiscernibility our examples require, what the child has effected is not an artwork. Something prevents it from entering the confederation of franchised artworks into which Picasso's die is accepted easily, if without immense enthusiasm. And in order to derive the maximum philosophical structure from the example, let us suppose a forger, a sly opportunist, inserts a blue painted tie into the world of the confounding of connoisseurs. He could, to be sure, like Van Meegeren, have invented a gap in his chosen artist's history to be filled with a forgery that was not a copy, in this instance perhaps a rose-coloured necktie to give a certain historical appropriateness to this chicanery. But we will stick to the simplest example, which makes it possible to imagine a Shakespearean situation of mistaken identities. No laughing matter if you happen to be an art dealer or in the business of insuring artworks. So suppose Coutts, or was it Canweiler, takes every necessary precaution, in spite of which the things in question become comically confused, with these results. The child's tie hangs to this very day in the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Luxembourg, and is insured for a pile. Picasso naturally disputed its authenticity and refused to sign it. Instead, he signed the forgery. The original has been confiscated by the Ministry of Counterfacts and lies in limbo with Van Meegeren's Christ at Emmaus, and a cigar box full of pieces claimed to be of the true cross, the one authentic occupant of a vault filled with shams. One day, perhaps, a doctoral candidate, under the direction of Professor Theodore Reff, will solve what is known in the literature as Das Hautsche problem by Picasso by counting threads, Though even when the identities are all suitably unscrambled, philosophers of arts will have the task of determining the status of a forgery which bears a signature of unmistakable genuineness. But that takes us considerably ahead of our story. Nelson Goodman, the foremost philosophical art dealer, has concerned himself with questions of forgery in languages of art. Bob's Merrill, 1968. The hard-headed question why there isn't any aesthetic difference between a deceptive forgery and an original work challenges a basic premise on which the very function of collector, museum, and art historian depend. He says this in a context in which there is an obvious temptation to ask what aesthetic difference it does make, inasmuch as the three tie objects are indiscernible, though I have heard this attitude expressed in connection with artworks of a measurably greater degree of sublimity than these, and with the intent of dismissing as irrelevant to experiencing them the sorts of allegedly grubby facts having to do with where and when and by whom the thing was done. I have read that the identical examination paper got different grades when the student who wrote it bore some such unhappy name as Elmer or Bertha than when it was presented as a paper by John or Mary, so the name attached to a thing quite plainly enters into our assessment of it. But the attitude expressed here has perhaps the force that such things ought not to figure, that we should give ourselves up to the work itself. Our re- so, our recent encounter with Pierre Menard should imply a cautionary attitude regarding such purist aesthetic imperatives, such ahistorical views of artworks. But then the entire structure of the examples with which we have been working cries out for an answer to the inverse of Goodman's question, whether an unnoticed, and let us even suppose an unnoticeable, difference can make an aesthetic difference. To be sure, we are not yet in a position to ponder aesthetic differences, ours being a prime question of the ontological difference between artworks and their non artistic counterparts. And there is a question whether this difference, which again is unnoticeable so far as examination of the object is concerned, can make anything like an aesthetic difference. And it ought to, one feels. The purists who ask us to surrender ourselves to the work itself have supposed, after all, that it is a work to which we are to surrender ourselves, and it is not clear what they would urge regarding objects that are in no sense works, like our fortuitously splattered parapolish rider, or if it is in some sense a work, its identity must be so different from that of the polished rider that, similarity of surface notwithstanding, it would be astonishing were there to be no difference in aesthetic response, whatever that may be. Goodman, in a curious way, rejects one of the conditions of the question, namely the condition of indiscernibility. It appears to be his view that indiscernibility is only momentary, that sooner or later differences will emerge. Knowing that one of a pair of things is a forgery is already enough of a difference for me to believe that there may be a difference between them that I can learn to perceive. And this belief, virtually as a regulative principle, assigns the present looking a role as training towards such a perceptual discrimination. Goodman then goes on to argue that no proof can be given that a perceptual difference may not be found, so things that look alike today may look so different tomorrow that it will seem retrospectively amazing that confusion ever could have arisen. And he enlists as evidence the extreme acuity of the eye and ear in registering astonishing differences on the basis of the most minute changes. So it is almost a problem in psychophysics rather than one in ontology. There is a great deal to be said for Goodman's analysis. It is beyond question that we may learn to effect discriminations by training, and that we may learn to make exceedingly fine distinctions as between, for example, wines. And often we can learn to see things that would have been invisible before, simply in consequence of the fact that ways of seeing are perhaps transparent to those whose ways of seeing they are, and these may turn, so to speak, opaque when they no longer are their ways of seeing. The history of art is filled with such examples. I have little doubt that the contemporaries of Giotto, astounded at the realism of his paintings, should just have seen men and women and angels in those paintings, and not a way of seeing men and women and angels, which we now recognize as Giotto's way of seeing men and women and angels. Giotto's mode of vision has become a kind of cultural artifact, which anyone can learn to identify. Van Meegeren's forgeries of Vermeer can now be seen as forgeries when they could not have been so seen in the 1930s, not because of chemical or X-ray analysis and not in terms of refined peering of the sort Goodman describes, but in virtue of the fact that they can now be seen as full of the mannerisms of 1930s painting, mannerisms which in 1930 would not have been seen as mannerisms, as ways of representing. When we are living a period of history, we do not necessarily know that that period will look like to a future historical consciousness. What that period will look like to a future historical consciousness. So the mere passage from one period to another may bring to the perceptual surface features that were hidden before. Finally, it may be said that it is virtually a matter of logical guarantee that there has to be a difference between two things not identical. But that is as much, I think, as can be said finally for Goodman's analysis. The logical point, while it guarantees that if A is not identical with B, then there must be a property F, such as A is F and B is not F, does not require that F be a perceptual property, and we have had enough practice with indiscernibilia to be able to offer actual instances where the differences are not such as may be registered by the senses. So it is possible that future investigation may reveal differences between two objects which are not perceptual differences, allowing therefore the logical possibility that two things may be perceptually indiscernible. Knowing that there is a difference may make a difference to the way we look at two works, and even to the way in which we respond to two works, but the difference need not be in the way we see them, and it is striking as a matter of concealed bias on Goodman's part that he should spontaneously have assumed that all aesthetic differences are perceptual differences. Furthermore, I think, whatever may be the case with aesthetic differences, even supposing Goodman is right, and that sustained and protracted peering and comparison will ultimately make a difference, so that we can learn to tell Lippo Lippi from Filipino Lippi and Vermeer from Peter de Hooch. Oui? Je sais pas pourquoi. Hein? C'est parce que je suis en direct, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Et elle est où? Pas sûr. Non? Bon, attendez, j'arrête mon lave. So, as we learn to tell Vaughn Romanet from Beaujolais, still this will not help us with the serious ontological question, namely that of deciding which is which between artworks and non-artworks. The three nectars, for example, may be noticeably different, without this entailing that the noticeable differences will identify which of them is an artwork and which is not, and this primarily through the fact that it is not clear that concepts like work of art and forgery are translatable into sets of simple perceptual predicates. We may in some cases be able to tell forgeries by inspection without its following that forgery is a perceptual concept. Its being a forgery, one would think, has something to do with its history, with the way in which it arrived in the world, and to call something an artwork is at least to deny that sort of history to it. Objects do not wear their histories on their surfaces. There is one final point. To suppose that the interesting differences between these three objects has anything to do with perceptual differences is almost comically to misclassify their artistic interest. There are paintings that reveal themselves only through trained and careful scrutiny. The compositions of Poussin or of Cézanne, or the amazing touch of paint in Morandi, are matters for appreciation and connoisseurship. But these objects are not of this order. Connoisseurship here is radically irrelevant, for Picasso's necktie has all the subtlety of a mackerel thrown in one's face. Whatever the aesthetic interest of the one indisputable work, whichever one it may be, it cannot lie here.